This is a biomarker that has nothing to do with stress. And I've started out, unlike everybody else, I've started out just by kind of enumerating what you'll see on the list of variables that, or various lists of variables that you've had in preparation for this workshop. Why do we measure lung function, and what are these measures all about? If you look through a list of measures and you see FEV1, FVC, you might see something called what's it called? Full ventilatory capacity. Oh, I'm not going to talk about that here. But FEV1 is the most commonly used. It means, say there, forced expiratory volume in 1 second, blowing the hardest you can into a little gizmo called a spirometer. What volume of air in liters can a person blow out in 1 second? So it measures two things. It measures how much air you can get into your lungs, and it measures how hard you can blow it out. And that's getting lots of air into your lungs, kind of obvious. It's good for you. But being able to blow out fast is a measure of the airways not being constricted or restricted in any way, which is what happens, for example, when people get asthma. And so it does you two good things, two useful things. Another measure that's often used is FVC, which is the total amount of air that you can blow out, not just in 1 second. Because you blow it. It's an interesting measurement issue, actually, that David found when he trained sociologists to do kind of field sociology and to collect biomarkers in the field. And he also had on his team a nurse, an experienced nurse. And what he discovered was that the people who had their measures taken by the sociologists never managed to get such high readings on these as the people who were examined by the nurse. And the nurse was really mean to the people and kept saying, "Go on, blow harder, blow harder." And what was pointed out was the sociologists didn't feel this was appropriate. And one of the things that points out is that there are all different kinds of things that can influence the measure that you get. I won't tell you the story of the blood pressure measures because it's kind of sexist. But some friends of mine proved that there was a difference in blood pressure measurement according to the gender of the person measuring it, for example. So these two are used as measures of chronic obstructive airway or pulmonary disease. That's what it's called nowadays. There used to be chronic bronchitis and emphysema. Nobody seems to talk about it anymore. And what you'll see when you're looking in papers or in lists of variables, COAD, chronic obstructive airway disease, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Pulmonary is just a fancy way of saying pertaining to the lungs. So those are the measures that you'll see and that you might want to use. Now the next bit is why you might want to use them. A little bit of biology. Lungs transfer oxygen from the air into the blood, and carbon dioxide we blow out from the blood into the air. Hemoglobin carries oxygen around. They're the things that make your red blood cells red. Carries oxygen around the body to all your organs. It's essential for organ function. The brain is particularly sensitive to being robbed of hemoglobin, but all your organs need it. So the more oxygen your lungs can hold, the more can be transferred to the rest of your body, and that's good for all your organs. How I started getting really interested in lung function was that a friend of mine in our pre-PhD years had a wonderful topic for his PhD, he was told he shouldn't do it because it was too politically sensitive, because it was about unemployment and its possible effect on the risk of heart disease. This was way back in the mid-'80s. And so he was told, "Oh, you're going to have to do lung function instead," by the supervisor. And what he discovered, in a very elegant piece of work, which is far too little cited, is that actually lung function is a massive predictor of heart disease. Now this won't come as any surprise to anybody who's worked on the Whitehall study, and I thought, that's interesting. I'm not a medic, by the way. I learned bits of biology as I went through a sort of social epidemiology career. Why should lung function be such a hugely powerful predictor of people likely to get a heart attack or to die of heart disease? So that was why I got interested. So here you have a little picture of how it all works. This is your body using up, well, I don't know exactly where to start. Here's the the oxygenated blood spin through your lungs, spin through that side of your left side. It comes around, it's nice and red because it's carrying lots of oxygen. So this is coming to feed all your bodily tissues. It's doing that. And then it carries away waste products, which is the carbon dioxide, it's water vapor, and it goes up to the right side of the heart. And the right side of the heart then pushes it back through the lungs, where it loses its waste products. You don't need to carry around a lot of carbon dioxide and water vapor, and pushes that out, and then takes in more oxygen, comes back into the left side of the heart, which then pushes it around. It's neat, isn't it? I think it's amazing, actually, this circulation. Yes, that's right, so I've said that. Yeah, okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. And here you also have just the labels, which kind of, in some, the labels of the bits of the heart, which in some senses can be quite useful. The descending aorta is the aorta which you hear about in the movies. You mustn't get shot through it or stabbed through it or whatever. And that's very important because it's carrying the oxygen. It's a huge vessel that's carrying the oxygenated blood down into your body. And then here it comes back, unoxygenated blood, back into the... Now this is I'm going to tell you a little story about what happens when the heart and the lungs get into an unbalanced state. And this was something, I just had to put this up here because it's a long time since I sort of studied all this and learned it all and so forth. And not being a medic, I've never done any, thank goodness, I've never done any, cutting bodies open anatomy. And when I saw this picture, I thought, wow, look how big the lungs are. In comparison to the heart, I've been sort of walking around with an idea that lungs were two little blobs on either side of the heart, not a bit of it. And I think the nice thing about this diagram is that it shows the enormous influence of the lungs, and it starts to help you understand why having something wrong with your lungs, having poor lung function, which you measure with the FEV, is something which is so predictive of other kinds of disease, particularly heart disease. Everybody laughed at me, all my other colleagues, most of whom are either have a clinical training or a biological training, they all thought it was hilarious. They said, you didn't realize that lungs were bigger than the heart? And I had to admit that I didn't. So lung disease, I hope I've shown how plausible this is, affects the whole of the body. When the lungs don't work well, the whole of your body suffers in one way or another because not enough oxygen is going to all the rest and the brain, which you need to function. And you get a buildup of carbon dioxide. And that's part of what makes you. It's not just the irritation of the tobacco smoke that makes you cough and wheeze. It's also all these other processes that if you do anything that damages your lungs, it's stopping you from efficiently getting rid of waste, carbon dioxide, and it's stopping the rest of your body from receiving enough oxygen. Now, this is slightly tricky, and I might have to get some help from Noriko and Lena here, but when I was learning about all this stuff, there used to be something called congestive heart failure, and there was a lot of, and there used to be something called left ventricular hypertrophy. And these were proven to be, once again, not surprisingly, very important predictors when I worked in a study of heart disease. And when if you look this up on Wikipedia now, it doesn't exist anymore. Nobody talks about, because I once said LVH to Harry Hemingway, and he spat at me. Well, he said, oh, we don't talk about that now. There's no such thing. So, because I always thought that these biological ways in which the heart and the lungs literally relate closely to each other were terribly important. Well, I'm glad Nina thinks they're important. Anyway, so this can happen in two ways. One way is that the lungs get congested. The right side of the heart has to push too hard. That's the right side. The right side is pushing the blue bit. The blue side of the heart is pushing blood into the lungs. If the lungs get congested by inflammation, tobacco smoke, furring up, tar, atmospheric junk, etc., the heart has to push harder and harder to get blood that's carrying the waste products back into the lungs. And what happens to that, when that happens, you get hypertrophy. The muscle is working so hard that it actually grows thicker and thicker. It requires extra little blood vessels to feed it. I think someone's going to talk about heart disease later on, but basically a heart attack is when one or more of the vessels which feed your heart muscle gets a blockage in it. And that causes an infarct, which is a death of tissue in the heart muscle. It's not a blockage in any of those big, that's what I used to think, it's not a blockage in those big blood vessels that I showed you. It's a blood vessel in the little it's a blockage in the little blood vessels that feed the muscle. And when that happens, the muscle can go into spasm. And that's one way of getting a heart attack. And the thicker that muscle becomes, if it becomes thicker than it should be, it's harder for these little blood vessels that feed it. Because the heart is like any other part of the body that I showed you. All the body needs to be fed with nice, clean, red, oxygenated blood. The heart needs to be fed in the same way as any other muscle. If you were running or jumping or doing exercise in the gym or whatever, the heart needs feeding just the same as your other muscles. And if you get a blockage there, you get a heart attack. But if you get an overdeveloped heart muscle, you have more work for those little vessels to do. And then that's what used to be called congestive heart failure, what I've just described. Because the lungs being congested causes the heart to back up and fail. Left-sided failure happens when you have chronic high blood pressure. If you have, for any reason, somebody was talking about this, too much blood, or you have narrowed vessels because of atheroma, because you fatty buildup in your blood vessels, or if you get too much stress, which narrows the little blood vessels in your extremities, when you have a fight and flight response, they close down. In case, I always say this, in case you're going to get some people have heard this a million times, in case you're going to get scratched by a tiger. Okay, your stress system is partly evolved to deal with sort of saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths and this kind of thing, so that one of the things that happens is the muscles demand more blood to be running, but then the peripheral vascular system, as it's called, the little bits of you that you don't need to run, what you don't want is to get blood gushing out if you get scratched. So if you have a chronic stress situation that chronically narrows all these little vessels, it can back up that bread bit. Okay, the bread bit is supposed to be pushing the blood around. It gets backed up. And from there, the blood can overflow, in a sense, back into the lungs, and you then get breathlessness, and you have a low FEV. It causes breathlessness from a non-lung related issue. So you can get that FEV can be a symptom not just of lung disease. One reason why another reason why these things are so predictive. It can be a symptom not just of lung disease, but also of possibly stress-related. I said I wasn't going to talk about stress, but possibly stress-related systemic problem for the whole of your circulation. So the last thing I want to do is to try and fit some of this into the framework. And this is partly just because that's what you'll be doing with the exercise tomorrow. There's David's framework, which I won't have to go through again because he's already explained it very well. And here's my last slide, is my attempt to fit what I've been talking about into the framework. So we've got these exposures, yes, structural and behavioral, yes? Those are exposures, aren't they, Dave? Right, yes. And from the structural exposures, I'm using the categories material, central nervous system mediated, and epigenetic. I haven't put anything in epigenetic there. Mina's going to talk about that tomorrow. Like all the rest of us were saying, Mina will do it, Mina will do it. Right, but from the social structure, you get differences in housing quality, for example, and that depends on the type of society you live in. Some societies have, like, for example, the person's income can be related with huge differences in housing quality with associated differences in how warm the house is, how damp it is, how hygienic it is. So you can get early lung problems or later on lung problems to do with any of those things, damp, cold, and infections. And by the way, one of the reasons why cold is associated with sudden heart attacks and deaths go up in the winter is because cold also closes down. You can feel it happening when you're getting cold. And cold also raises your blood pressure. Also, another material pathway coming from the social structure is job hazards, fumes and dust exposure. And since a lot of the jobs with most fumes and dust exposures don't pay much, these two tend to be related, but only in societies that have the same structure. Okay, so there's nothing inevitable about these things all being related. You have to check it out in each data set you look at. They might not always be. It might not always be the case that people with a lower income, in a relatively low part of the income distribution in the country you're studying. I mean, for example, it might be completely different in Sweden than it would be in, say, Britain or the United States. CNS mediated, well, I'm calling smoking a stress-related rather than a cultural issue. Epigenetic, I don't know. And then, well, smoking can be related to stress, just as Noriko showed about drinking. But there's also a cultural aspect to smoking. You can have a smoking culture, and the behavioral cultural, the smoking culture, which comes under that heading, will be the cause for your lungs to have the material, literal exposure to tobacco smoke. That arises out of culture. Now, epigenetic, I've just put down something there to be a little bit controversial. So I put parental smoking, because I know George Daly Smith has done some work on that the parents, if your parents smoke, you have a different epigenetic pattern.
If you smoke, you have a different epigenetic pattern.
Right,
So
and we don't know whether that's present before the child. Parental smoking and children's smoking is strongly related. But do we know whether the children of parents who smoke? Well, if they smoke, they're exposed. Okay, so you can't. Okay, but that's the sort of one of those Lamarckian ideas. To go back to whoever was talking about Lamarck, David. The Lamarckian idea here is that if you smoke or eat too much or I don't know what, you change your own genes, and that this change can be passed on. So it's what's called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So you have acquired the characteristics, let's say, of overweight or of unhealthy eating, and your child tends to be the same. Now, for many years, we never needed much explanation of that because it's cultural. Okay, so you're brought up in a household where X and Y, and as Noriko was saying about alcohol, I was brought up in a household where I was drinking a very great deal of alcohol. I just never questioned it. It was just part of the culture I lived in, was people drank a lot of alcohol, and I never thought anything about it. So all these things can be passed on through the cultural pathway, like in the same way as your language or your accent might be. But the epigenetic idea is, I have seen this written down, the epigenetic idea is that if you drink too much, smoke too much, etc., the reason why your children will tend to do the same thing is because you've changed something about your own genes, and that change has passed on to your children. And that's the Lamarckian idea, which, when we were all being taught genetics, was regarded as, I learned a bit about that in philosophy of science, not in genetics, but the idea that an acquired characteristic could then be passed on. It's like saying if you teach somebody a language, their child will, actually this is a rather good example, their child will grow up speaking the same language.
I think the passing it on, it has to be through kind of soma type cells that, get into the child. So it's not as clear, there is some discussion about how much is passed on to your children in terms of epigenetic changes, or what is and what isn't. We don't really. It's
very hard to sort it all out, isn't it? But anyway, I just put there as a sort of slightly, because I thought I'd better put something epigenetic. Because otherwise I got an empty category. So anyway, I hope that's given you some idea of moving from a measure to, I've done this the opposite to what you'll be doing in your project, where you move from an idea to what you need to measure it. Okay. But I've done it slightly the other way around, to move from the measure that you see to what it reflects about how a human person's biology is working, to then fitting it into a framework of something like this. Okay?